Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really interesting challenge in AI.
Yeah.
It's all about how to make those smaller language models, understand us better, more like the really big, powerful ones.
Right. Intent alignment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we're using a research paper as our guide here. It's called Zephyr, Direct Distillation of LM Alignment.
It's a fascinating area because you hear so much about the huge models, right? And this paper basically asks, can we take that ability to really get what a user means? They call it alignment,
Uh-huh.
and sort of distill it, transfer it into smaller, much more accessible models, which, well, that could be huge for getting powerful AI out there more widely. It's a big deal in the field.
Totally. And that's where you, listening, come in. If you want to get a good handle on important tech topics fast, without drowning in jargon, well, you're in the right place. This deep dive should give you a really clear picture of a, frankly, cutting-edge AI technique. And the results are pretty surprising. They definitely challenge that whole bigger is always better idea in AI.
Absolutely. Our main focus is this paper, and the method it introduces distilled direct preference optimization, or DDPO for short.
DDPO. Okay.
The whole idea is taking that alignment from the big guys, sometimes the closed source ones, and baking it into smaller open models. And the outcome they showcase is this model called ZPHYR7B.
Okay, so our mission today, unpack how ZPR7B came about, figure out what's special about DDPO, and well understand why these results are getting attention. I mean, we're talking a 7 billion parameter model that they're claiming performs like or even beats models with 70 billion parameters.
That's a bold claim.
Right. Okay, so the paper kicks things off by framing the core problem, this alignment thing.
Yeah, and what's interesting is they point out that while we've gotten pretty good at improving task accuracy in smaller models, using this thing called distilled supervised fine-tuning, DSFT.
DSFT, right.
These models often still lack, well, intent alignment. They don't always quite get what the user is really asking for, especially in natural conversation.
So, okay, put that in simple terms. What does intent alignment actually, look like or not look like?
Well, imagine you ask a model a question just like you'd ask a person. A well-aligned model gets the underlying point right. It responds helpfully, appropriately. A less aligned one, it might give you a technically correct answer based on the words, but it feels rigid or maybe misses the nuance. It's about understanding the spirit of the prompt, not just the letters, and that's the gap they're trying to bridge.
Got it. That makes sense. So how do you measure that? How do you, put a score on understanding the spirit?
That's a really key question. The paper mentions benchmarks specifically designed for this, like MT-Bench and ALPA-Keyball.
Okay.
These aren't just about factual accuracy. They test how well models follow instructions, how helpful they are, and crucially, how much humans tend to prefer their answers.
So human preference is a factor.
Exactly. And what these benchmarks have shown, apparently, is that the big proprietary models usually score higher on alignment than the open models, even the ones trained with human feedback. So that really sets the stage. You know, it shows there's a clear need for better ways to align these open models.
Okay, problem understood. So let's get to the proposed solution, this DDPO method. What's the secret sauce here?
Well, the big shift is moving away from relying on, say, lots of expensive human labeling.
Right.
Or these complex reinforcement learning algorithms like PPO, proximal preference optimization. Instead, they use something called AI feedback, or AIF.
AI feedback.
Yeah.
So AI judging other AI.
Sort of, yeah. They got feedback from an ensemble, a group of capable teacher models. These models provided examples of good or preferred responses. That became their preference data.
Okay.
And then they applied their learning method, BDPO, distilled direct preference optimization, using that AI-generated preference data.
And you mentioned earlier the big plus with DDPO is efficiency.
Exactly. That's what makes it potentially so impactful. We're talking like just a few hours of training needed. And importantly, unlike some other methods, it doesn't need this extra step of sampling lots of possible answers during the fine-tuning itself, which can eat up a lot of computing power.
Okay, much leaner. So how did they actually do it? Walk us through the steps they described for creating ZPHYR7B.
Right, so it was basically a three-stage pipeline. Step one was distilled supervised fine-tuning, DSFT, using UltraChat.
Okay, step one, DSFT with UltraChat. What's UltraChat?
UltraChat is this big data set of conversations. They used GPT 3.5 Turbo, a pretty capable model itself, to simulate chats between a user and an AI assistant.
AI talking to itself to create training data.
Essentially, yeah. across loads of different topics. The goal was to generate a really large amount of dialogue data, to give the starting model a solid foundation in just having a conversation.
And which model did they start fine-tuning?
They began with Mistral 7B, which, even as a base model, is considered quite strong for its size in the open source world.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier sometimes these generated data sets aren't perfect. Did they have to clean up UltraChat?
They did, yeah. Data cleaning seems like it's always needed.
Huh.
They noticed things like weird capitalization, and also the AI generating the data sometimes threw in phrases like, as a large language model, even when it didn't make sense.
Oh, right. Those boilerplate phrases.
Exactly. So they ran some automated fixes for the capitalization and just filtered out those kinds of unhelpful stock phrases just to polish the training data.
Makes sense. How much data are we talking about after cleaning?
They ended up with about 200,000 examples for this initial DSFT step.
Okay. So step one, build that conversational base with cleaned up AI-generated chat data. What's step two?
Step 2 is where the AI feedback, the AIF, really comes in. This was AIF collection using ultra feedback.
Ultra feedback. Okay, tell us about that one. How did they collect this feedback?
So ultra feedback is another data set. For a bunch of prompts, they got multiple different language models to generate answers.
Okay, several possible answers for each question.
Right. And then this is key. They used a really powerful model, GPT-4, to basically rank or score all those different responses.
Ah, so GPT-4 acts as the judge here.
Exactly. Judging based on things like, how well did it follow the instruction? How helpful was it? That kind of thing.
Okay, so now you have ranked responses. How does that become the preference data?
From those rankings, they created pairs. For each prompt, the response that GPT-4 ranked highest was labeled chosen,
The winner?
the winner. And then, interestingly, they picked one of the lower scoring responses at random and labeled it rejected.
Huh. Not necessarily the absolute worst one, but just a lower scoring one. Why do that?
Yeah, the paper suggests this adds a bit more variety to the preference pairs. It stops the model just learning to tell apart amazing answers from total garbage. It has to learn more subtle distinctions about what makes one response better than another, potentially quite similar. One makes the learning maybe more robust.
Interesting nuance. Okay, so now they have prompts, each with a chosen best AI answer and a rejected less good AI answer, all judged by GPT-4. That takes us to the final step, right?
Step 3. Distilled Direct Preference Optimization, DDPO.
Okay, how does DDPO actually work with this chosen rejected data?
So now they take the model they already fine-tuned in step 1, the one with the basic conversational ability, and they refine it further using these preference pairs from step 2. The core idea of DDPO is to directly teach that model to prefer the chosen type of response over the rejected type.
How does it teach it that?
It essentially adjusts the model's parameters so that, given a prompt, the probability of generating something like the chosen response goes up, and the probability of generating something like the rejected response goes down. It's learning an implicit reward signal directly from these paired examples.
And crucially, this is done without that complex sampling you mentioned earlier with methods like PPO.
Precisely. That's the direct part of DPO. It's a more direct optimization based on the preference data itself,
Right.
rather than needing to sample lots of potential outputs and estimate rewards during training.
Okay, that clarifies the process. 3 steps. Build the base conversation skills with DSFT on UltraChat, get AI judge preference pairs from Ultra Feedback, then use DDPO to tune the model towards those preferences.
Yeah. The big question, what were the results? Did Zephyr HYR7B actually deliver on that bold claim?
Well, the results reported in the paper are pretty striking. On MT Bench, that benchmark we talked about, Zephyr HYR7B, just a 7 billion parameter model, reportedly outperformed LMA2 Chat 70B.
Whoa.
And the paper makes a point of saying LMA2 Chat 70B is, a much, much larger model that was trained using RLHF reinforcement learning from human feedback, which is generally considered a very strong alignment technique.
So it beat a model 10 times its size, trained with a well-regarded method. On that specific benchmark, yes, according to their results. Figure 1 in the paper gives you a nice visual breakdown across different skills like writing, role play, reasoning. Comparing ZPHYR to other models, even closed ones like GPT-4 and Claude.
That really is an underdog story in AI terms.
It kind of is. And Table 1 gives you more granular detail, comparing ZPHYR against other open and proprietary models on both MT Bench and AlpaCaval. The takeaway is that it hits state-of-the-art performance among the 7B open models.
Okay, state-of-the-art for its size class. Does it beat all the bigger models?
Not necessarily across every single metric, no. The very biggest proprietary models like GPT-4 still tend to lead overall, but its performance relative to its size is what's remarkable, and they do suggest that applying this DDPO method to bigger base models could push performance even higher.
Right. And it wasn't just about chat, was it? Did it hold up on more like traditional academic tests?
Good point. Table 2 looks at the benchmarks like ARC for science questions, HelloSwag for common sense reasoning, MMLU for broad knowledge, Truthful QA for avoiding misinformation.
And how did it do there?
Again, pretty well. Generally better than other 7D models, and on some tasks, it was apparently reaching the performance level of models in the 40B parameter range.
So the alignment tuning didn't seem to hurt its general knowledge or reasoning.
That's what the results suggest, yeah. Which is important. You don't want to make a model good at chatting, but bad at everything else. It seems like they managed to improve alignment without sacrificing those core capabilities.
Now, good researchers always check their work.
Right.
Did they try to figure out if every step of their DDPO process was actually necessary? Like an ablation study?
Yes, exactly. Table 3 covers their ablation experiments. They tried things like, what if we just skipped the first DSFT step and went straight to DDPO?
And
Performance tanked. It was really poor, which kind of confirms that the model needs that initial grounding in how to generate coherent responses before it can learn the finer points of preferences.
makes sense. You need to learn to talk before you learn manners.
Yeah, basically. They also tried just doing more supervised fine-tuning, but only on the chosen responses from the preference data without the DDPO mechanism.
Just trying to imitate the good examples.
Right. And that was better than nothing, but not nearly as effective as the full DSFT followed by DDPO process. So the combination seemed key.
Okay, so each step played a critical role.
Yeah.
Now, there was something interesting you mentioned earlier, or rather, that the paper mentioned, about overfitting during the DDPO step.
Ah, yes, that was a really curious observation. They noted that during the DDPO training phase, the model's accuracy on the training preference pairs shot up really quickly, looking like it was overfitting to that specific data.
Which usually sounds like a bad thing in machine learning, right?
Usually, yes. You worry it won't generalize. But, and this is shown in figure 3, this apparent overfitting didn't actually seem to hurt its performance on the evaluation benchmarks like MT-Bench.
Huh?
In fact, the version of ZPH-YR7B that performed best overall was trained for a specific number of epochs where this overfitting was already apparent.
So what looked like overfitting on the training data didn't translate to poor real-world performance.
Exactly. It suggests there might be a more nuanced relationship between the training dynamics of these preference optimization methods and the actual downstream capabilities you care about. It's not always straightforward.
Fascinating. A good reminder that the metrics during training don't always tell the whole story. Okay, so like any good study, they must have acknowledged some limitations, right? What did they flag?
They did. A few important ones. First, the reliance on GPT-4 as the evaluator in benchmarks like MT-Bench and AlpaCaval.
Why is that a limitation?
Well, since GPT-4 is itself a highly capable model, likely trained with similar alignment techniques, there's a potential bias. The benchmark might favor models that produce answers stylistically similar to GPT-4's.
The judge might have its own preferences baked in.
Could be. They also pointed out they haven't really explored how well DDPO scales up. Like, what happens if you apply it to a much larger base model, say the LAMA270B itself? Could you get even bigger gains? That's an open question. And finally, the main focus here was really on improving helpfulness. They didn't dive deep into safety aspects, like making sure the model robustly refuses to generate harmful or biased content.
Right, safety is a whole other dimension of alignment.
It is. They include some examples in the appendix, figure 6, showing how the model responds to potentially problematic prompts. It suggests DDPO improves helpfulness, but dedicated safety work would likely be needed on top.
Okay, that gives us a really solid overview, so let's try and boil it down. What are the absolute key takeaways from the ZPHYR paper and our deep dive?
I think the main takeaway is that this research shows a really powerful and, importantly, quite efficient way to align smaller language models with user intent.
Using AI feedback in DDPO?
Exactly. Using AI feedback curated by models like GPT-4 and then applying this distilled direct preference optimization technique. They've shown pretty convincingly that a 7 billion parameter model can really punch above its weight, rivaling or even beating models 10 times its size on some key alignment benchmarks.
And all without reading massive amounts of human labeling or those complex RL setups.
Right. That's a big part of the story, the potential efficiency gain.
So why should someone listening right now really care about this? What's the bottom line for the average person interested in AI?
Well, I think it's significant because it hints that we might not always need those absolutely enormous, energy-hungry, super expensive models to get AI that's actually helpful and understands us well.
Mm.
Techniques like DDPO could lead to more accessible AI, maybe more powerful models running efficiently on less powerful hardware, maybe even locally someday. It makes high-quality, user-friendly AI potentially less exclusive.
So it democratizes good AI alignment a bit more.
That's the potential, yeah.
Mm.
It highlights how clever training methods, not just raw scale, can make a huge difference in bridging that gap between the smaller open models and the giant proprietary ones.
It definitely makes you rethink that bigger is always better mantra.
Huh.
Okay, so final question. What's one lingering thought or provocative idea this research leaves us with? Something for our listeners to chew on.
I think it really opens the door to asking, how far can we push this? How well can we align relatively small models using purely AI-generated feedback and clever optimization? Can a 7B model eventually rival a 175B model across the board with the right techniques?
Right. What's the ceiling here?
Exactly. And alongside that, how do we best ensure safety as we get better at distilling capabilities? If we're transferring abilities from larger models, we need to be careful about what else we might be transferring.
Good point. Safety can't be an afterthought.
Definitely not. And just generally, as these distillation and alignment techniques improve, how is that going to change the whole landscape of AI development and who gets to use the best tools? It's a really dynamic space. ZEHYR7B feels like a significant marker on that journey.
Fascinating step forward.
Absolutely. And for anyone who really wants to get their hands dirty, the paper points to the Hugging Face Alignment Handbook where they've released the code and models, so you can actually explore this stuff yourself.
Perfect. A great place to continue the exploration. Thanks for walking us through that.
My pleasure. Really interesting paper.